India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, the very symbol of imperialism, celebrated its freedom. Mahatma Gandhi was the father of independence. His economic ideal was a simple India of self-sufficient villages. Pandit Nehru, the first Prime Minister, wanted to industrialize and combine British parliamentary democracy with Soviet-style central planning.
In the 1950s, India was the mecca of all economists. You talk of any economist in the world, and they were advising the Indian government. And the advice was, you must have a state-led model of industrial growth. The public sector must occupy what came to be called the commanding heights of the economy. And that's why steel, coal, machine tools, capital goods, all the areas of heavy industry were in the public sector and not in the private sector.
Nehru put his faith in technology.
Nehru was a rational thinker, and he wanted to apply science and technologies to solve the great mass poverty that prevailed at the time of independence.
Under Nehru, central planning became a form of science.
Nehru was always recruiting intellectuals in India on his side in the cause of planning. And there was this genius statistician, Mahalanobis, who was head of the Indian Statistical Institute.
Nehru asked Mahalanobis to think about how to plan an economy. The brilliant Mahalanobis succeeded in expressing the entire Indian economy in a single mathematical formula.
Let YT equal national income, CT equal consumption, and KT equal investment at time into open bracket 1 plus lambda k beta k close bracket minus 1 are fractions of investment allocated to industries producing capital goods, that is K sector, and consumer goods, that is C sector respectively. We shall write.
People believed this perfect mathematical model could be applied in a less than perfect world.
And at that time, Mahalanobis' model was hailed as one of the pioneering mathematical models for planning in a mixed economy. And that made Mahalanobis very influential.
India became the model of economic development for newly independent nations. Across the developing world, socialism, planning, government control, regulation, and ownership, these became the gospel. All over Africa, people looked to socialism to lead them out of poverty. Across South America, governments chose state control as the way to modernize. The apparent success of communist countries like the Soviet Union and China seemed to show the way. By 1950, Hayek's market economics were so completely out of fashion that when he sought a full-time academic job in the United States, only one university was willing to hire him.
Chicago has always been an exceptional place, out of the mainstream. Chicago is geographically isolated. This affects Chicago's intellectual influence in many more areas than economics.
The University of Chicago's intellectual influence would grow. 8 professors and another 11 economists from Chicago went on to win Nobel Prizes. Gary Becker is one of them.
When I came as a graduate student to Chicago in 1951, I was flabbergasted by how stimulating the atmosphere was. I had been a very good student at Princeton. My first day in Friedman's class, he raised a question, I answered. That's no answer, that's just rephrasing the question. That was the example of how blunt people were.
Nobody was very polite. And people were interested in ideas and argument, and not in making sure you didn't ruffle anybody's feathers.
If you're sitting in a seminar room and somebody up there is saying something which, if imbibed by your students who are sitting in that same room, is going to lead them astray, it's up to you to call that guy right now, you see, and not later. And that, I think, is sort of the spirit that prevailed in the Chicago workshop system. There wasn't that much fighting in the lunches. They were pretty cordial.
Lunches at the Quadrangle Club were famous for the intensity of intellectual discussion. And one man came to dominate those debates.
Somehow Milton managed to set the agenda of argument. And so there was a saying, everybody loves to argue with Milton, particularly when he isn't there, because he's a good arguer.
Milton Friedman was becoming the most articulate spokesman for the so-called Chicago School of Economics.
The Chicago School meant was a strong belief in minimal government and an emphasis on free market as a way to control the economy.
You know, in many ways, Milton Friedman was a devil figure in my youth in a Keynesian household of economists because he seemed, with his emphasis on individualism, freedom, and markets, to be so unconcerned with fairness.
Liberals may have loathed the Chicago School, but Hayek felt on home ground in an intellectual atmosphere so like the Vienna of his youth.
Our vision is that the forces of the market are just that. They are forces. They are like the wind and the tides. If you want to try to ignore them, you ignore them at your peril. If you find a way of ordering your life which harnesses these forces to the benefit of your society, that's the way to go.
But in Washington, Keynes was still king of the hill. 19 years after he died, his face was on the cover of Time magazine.
Keynes's influence on economics at mid-century can't be exaggerated. The economic advice that economists gave to policymakers said the only reason you have bad economic outcomes is because the government's not doing enough. It sounds almost like central planning, doesn't it?
Washington's Keynesians saw the economy not as a force of nature, but a sophisticated machine to be fine-tuned by technocrats like themselves. When Hayek moved back to his native Austria, he was depressed. The success of mixed economies made his free market theories, and Hayek himself, seem more irrelevant than ever.
The world was very much a socialist world. His ideas were not fashionable. Nobody seemed to listen to him. Nobody seemed to agree with him. He was alone.
Hayek found his ideas shunned by the academic world.
Well, most of the departments became dislike me, so much so that I can feel it to the present day, that economists very largely tend to treat me as an outsider.
He was living in a provincial town and stuck in a rut. But the outside world was beginning to change. Skimming the newspaper in his usual restaurant, Hayek read how inflation and unemployment were rising at the same time. There was a new word to describe it: stagflation.